Mark chapter 12. Let's go before the Lord in prayer. Jesus, we desire to worship and honor you this morning, and I thank you so much, dear God, that you have blessed us with people who love you, sheep who love each other. And I ask and pray, dear God, that this morning as we study your word, as we get in depth into it, I pray, dear God, that we would focus in on what it is you want to speak to our hearts about. I pray, dear Jesus, that you would work mightily within us. Maybe there's some of us here that are in sin. And so I pray, dear God, that you would convict us of that sin this morning. Maybe there are some of us here who just need some encouragement, and I pray that you would encourage us this morning through your word. I pray, dear Jesus, that above all, that if there's anyone here who doesn't know you, that they would come to the saving knowledge of you this morning. And so we give you this time. We know that your word will never return void, and we worship you in it. In Jesus' name, and all God's people would say, all right. I heard of a story of an office manager who was sitting at kind of just a staff meeting, and he was getting really annoyed because he wasn't getting what he believed was the respect he deserved. He thought, I'm the boss, I'm the authority in this place, I should have respect, I should be, taken care of, and you should listen to my words. And so he decided, the next day, he would put up a sign. And he put up this sign over his office door that said, "I'm the boss, listen to me." And so he thought, this would solve the problems. Well, he went to lunch, and he came back, and there was a sticky note over the sign that said, "Your wife called, she wants her sign back." Whether we like it or not, all of us are under some form of authority. Whether we are employees working for an employer, whether we're church members under the authority of the leadership in the church, simply, being U.S. citizens, we're under authority of people over us. And for many of us, when we think about the word authority, when we think about people being in charge of us, we don't like that idea. For some of us, it maybe makes us cringe. It makes us kind of step back a bit, repel from it. And the reason being is because ingrained within our culture, within us as U.S. citizens, are what we would call Enlightenment ideas that we as U.S. citizens believe in and breathe. Kind of the idea of individual freedoms or intrinsic rights or the idea of autonomous self. And we find this in every part of our culture. We see it in our movies, our music, our politics, in films like Bonnie and Clyde or Robin Hood, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where you kind of buck against authority, Twilight, where all the cool kids and vampires rebel against authority, The Hunger Games. You see this idea of not allowing authority to rule over you. We see it in our TV shows. If you're a fan of the TV show Firefly, some of you might have seen that. But Mel, one of the main characters, his whole goal is to misbehave against the Alliance. Netflix, people, Netflix. You guys got to watch it. We see it in our music, right? Green Day's Don't Want to Be an American Idiot. You see it, for example, in other parts of music, like Public Enemy's Fight the Power. Beastie Boys, You Gotta Fight for Your Right to Party. Bob Dylan's The Times Are Changing. And while most of us would never come out and say, I can do whatever I want, there might be some people that would say that. Most people quietly live their lives thinking that, they can do whatever they want. You see it applied, for example, when we complain about getting a speeding ticket. I got a ticket. Why? Well, because the officer said I was doing, 47 miles an hour. Well, what was the speed limit? Well, 30. Well, yeah, you deserve a ticket. Well, who says? Who gets to put that? And we on and on it goes. We celebrate individualism. The fact that we're not alike. The fact that, we do what we want, we dress how we want, we're different, just like everybody else, right? Sometimes we think we're the center of our own universe, and the reality is man was not designed by God to be the center of his own universe. As a matter of fact, man was designed rather that God would be the center of man's universe. And when man becomes the center of his own universe, and he rebels against the things of God, things go wrong. In particular, when it comes to having respect for the authority that God has set over us. And we've seen a diminishing thought line with that kind of in a post-World War II era, where since World War II, the idea of bucking against authority, running away from authority, having authority over us is not liked. But authority, whether governmental, management, spiritual authority, are all designed by God for a reason and for a purpose. And this morning in Mark chapter 12, Jesus speaks on the spiritual authority and governmental authority and the Christian's role within those things. And so if you're taking notes this morning, I've titled this morning's message, All in Authority. And we'll be looking at 2 points. We'll be looking at verses 1 through 12, looking at management, in particular heavenly management. And then verse 13 through 17, we'll be looking at governmental authority and the role of government over us. Now, if it's your first time or you haven't been with us in a while, we're excited that you're here. But just so that we're all on the same page, we are currently in the Gospel of Mark in what we would call Passion Week. I know Passion Week isn't for a little bit as Easter approaches, but we're looking at the last few chapters of the Gospel of Mark and looking at basically the last week of Jesus' life. And the Gospel of Mark was written by John Mark, who was Barnabas' cousin, and he was Peter's right-hand guy. He's the one that's kind of dictating the Gospel of Mark to Mark. And Mark is a real action-packed gospel. It's quick-paced. If you read it, it's Jesus doing this and Jesus doing that, and it's kind of pant, because it goes through a lot. It goes through a lot of ground, covers a lot of ground, and we're kind of building up to the inevitable showdown of Jesus on the cross. But before he does, he's confronted by the Pharisees here in Mark chapter 12. And Jesus uses a parable to reinforce the fact that the religious leaders were not following the authority that God had set up over them. As a matter of fact, they were wanting to live by their own authority. And so, this is where we hop into our first point, management of a heavenly kind, you could say. It says in chapter 12, verse 1, "And then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He set a hedge around it, dug a place for the wine vat, and built a tower. And then he leased it to vine dressers and went into a faraway country. Now at vintage time, he sent a servant to the vine dressers, that he might receive some of the fruits of the vineyard from the vine dressers. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent another servant, and at him they threw stones, wounded him in the head, and sent him away shamefully treated. And again he sent another, and him they killed. And many others, beating some and killing some. And therefore, still having one son, his beloved, he also sent him to them last, saying, they will respect my son. But those vine dressers said amongst themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And so they took him and killed him and cast him out of the vineyard. Therefore, what will the owner of that vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is what the Lord is doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they sought to lay hands on him, but feared the multitude, for they knew he had spoken the parable against them. And so they left and went away. Jesus starts by speaking in a parable form. The Gospel of Mark doesn't have a lot of parables. The last time we saw a parable in the Gospel of Mark was in Mark chapter 4, many months ago. But the word parable comes from the Greek word parabole. It literally means to throw alongside. And so the idea here is Jesus was wanting to convey a spiritual truth to these religious leaders, and so he decided he was going to throw a story alongside it to kind of give them a picture and an image of who they were and what God was doing. Parables serve two purposes. Number one, they showed you God, but number two, they showed you yourself. It was kind of like a window and a mirror. A window to see the Lord more clearly, but a mirror to show you yourself, so that you could see maybe some areas of your life that are wrong and that you need to change. And so what ends up happening here is, remember, Peter is dictating to Mark this gospel, and I think Peter would remember this particular parable because later on, Peter would write a book. It's called 1 Peter. It's a pretty original title, huh? He would write 1 Peter, and in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 7, he would say, "Therefore, to you who believe, he is precious. But to those who are disobedient, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone." He remembered this story in particular, and sometimes stories are good like that. A little story can sometimes help us remember a spiritual truth. And so that's exactly what Jesus is doing here, and he begins with this parable of a man who planted a vineyard. Jesus would use the things around him to help convey these spiritual things. So he would use, one time there was this guy and he was sowing some seed, and the people around him would understand that. Why? Because, that morning they probably sowed some seed. They would understand a vine dresser, and they would understand vineyards, and they would understand a tower, and they would understand a wine vat, and they would understand a hedge built around them. They would have grasped that. Today, if Jesus was speaking today in parabolic form, Jesus would say things like, I'm the Wi-Fi, and those that are connected into me, can reach plethora of, internet. I don't know, but he would use things that are common to our day. But in that day, being in Israel, an agricultural society, he used these forms of parables. And so notice, it's a pretty simple parable to really see and understand. Notice what we would say is basically God is the landowner. He uses Isaiah chapter 5 here. If you want to go and read it, you can go read it on your own, but we won't read it because of time. But Isaiah chapter 5, Jesus uses this as kind of a stepping board to speak of this parable to convey a spiritual truth to these religious leaders. And it's pretty simple. It's not hard to interpret that there is a landowner, most likely God. Vineyard is probably the nation of Israel. There are vine dressers, probably, speaking of the Jews. There are servants who come from God, probably the prophets. And ultimately, God or the landowner would send his one and only son. And the vine dressers would kill that one and only son. And so it's a really pretty easy parable to figure out. But notice what it says in chapter 12, verse 1. It says, a man planted a vineyard, set a hedge around it, dug a place for the wine vat, built a tower, and leased it to the vine dressers, and then he went into a faraway country. Here, God has planted Israel in a special place. He has given Israel a watchtower. He has given them a wine vat. He has blessed them greatly. He's given them a watchtower to protect themselves from thieves, a hedge built around them to protect themselves from wild animals. And if you look today, God is still even blessing Israel today. If you were to kind of Google map Israel today, if you get a chance to do it, it's pretty interesting because when you do it, Israel is green and everything around it is brown. It's an amazing feat, the fact that they're able to have these amazing gardens and a good fruit and a lot of growth in a very dry and arid climate. And you may recall, here's God, the authority who owns this land, and he's given it to these vine dressers to take care of. And yet, ultimately, they would reject God's management. Do you remember Jesus coming into Jerusalem after the triumphal entry, and he would say, O Jerusalem, the one who stones the prophets and kills those who are sent to you. How I wished I could have gathered you together like a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not have it. He speaks of these people that are sent to the Jews, and yet they killed them. If you were a landowner, this wasn't uncommon in that day. If you were a landowner, you would own a land, and maybe you would kind of have a bunch of different parts of land, and you would have people working on the land for you, vine dressers. It's the same as a shepherd and a kind of a hireling who would take care of the sheep. They're just kind of renting it. And as the landowner, you get some kind of rights. Because you're the authority, you own the land, you get some rights. You get maybe a third of the produce that's grown from the vineyard. You would get maybe half of it, upwards of half. And when it came time to collect, the owner would usually send a servant to collect the stuff. Notice it tells us in verse 2, now at vintage time came, basically harvesting season, he sent some servants to the vine dressers that he might receive some of the fruit. But they took the servants and beat them. They threw stones at another, and they killed some of them. This was a kind of a reminder for the nation of Israel. Remember when God would send his servants, he would send his prophets to them. And what did the nation of Israel do to the prophets? If God called you to be a prophet, it was never an easy job. It was never a fun job. God would tell you to do wacky things, like lay on your side, left side, for a year in the middle of the town square, proclaiming the truth. I mean, he would tell another prophet to strip naked and go around preaching the truth, the naked truth. You know, like it's just, you know, God would call you to do some weird things, but yet you would go as God's prophet. And when they would go, what would happen to them? Well, Jeremiah was beaten and put in stocks. Isaiah was sawn in two. Zechariah was stoned to death, and not Colorado stoned. He was killed. Jot this down, Hebrews 13, 35 through 38. And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mocking and scourging, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. They were tempted, they were slain with swords. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered the deserts and mountains and dens and caves of this earth. If you were called to be a prophet of the landowner, it was not an easy job. But yet, what we see in this story is Jesus is basically giving Israel its history. God has blessed you with this place, and he's put you as the Jews, as the vine dressers, and God would send his messengers, his servants to you, but you wouldn't have it and you would kill them. And so ultimately, in God's great moment of compassion and grace, this manager up in the sky, you could say, sends his only son. Martin Luther said, if I were God and the world treated me the way it's treated him, I would kick the world and the wretched thing to pieces. Right? I mean, think of all the things that we did to the Lord, how we rebel against him, but yet God in his grace, notice verse 6 through 8, would send his only son. Having one son, he would send him thinking, you know what, they'll respect my son. They'll respect my son, but that wasn't the case. At first glance, it seems kind of crazy. Like, who do these farmers think they are? Who do they think they are that they can get away with killing the owner's servants? That they could get away with doing this, but that's just the point. The Jewish people, as well as all of us, well, we think we can get away with things. It's not logical, but sin is never logical. We think we can run away from God. We think we can be, who we want, when we want, wherever we want, and how we want. Why? Because we're the center of our own universe. We justify our sin. Well, at least I'm not as bad as that guy. Well, I've never done that. I'm not hurting anyone, but let me tell you, all sin affects everyone, and you never sin in a void. But we sin. And God, in his grace and in his mercy, notice, would send his only son. It's a reminder of Isaiah 9:6, for unto us a son is born, or a child is born, and a son is given. Charles Spurgeon said, if you reject him, he'll answer you with tears. If you wound him, he bleeds out cleansing. If you kill him, he dies to redeem you. If you bury him, he raises again to bring you resurrection. Jesus is the manifestation of love, and no matter how many times we reject him, no matter how many times we reject his messengers, no matter how many times we even, kill the Son, he still sends his Son anyway. He still loves us. And Jesus is basically describing the things that are going to happen to him here soon. In about 4 days, Jesus is going to be the one killed. Notice, it says that they cast him out of the vineyard. They didn't even give the Son a proper burial. And that would be the case with Jesus. While, yes, Jesus would be buried by his loved ones, he was humiliated. He was disgraced. He was stripped naked, hung on a cross like a criminal. Why? Because he loved the vine dressers. Because he loved us. No matter how many times we reject him, he still pursues us. Hebrews 13, verse 12 and 13 says, "Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach." And then notice Jesus changes the metaphor here as he's speaking to them. And he quotes Psalm 118, talking about a stone that the builders have rejected. The stone is, the Son. And they've rejected him. It's a picture of a builder who throws out a particular cornerstone. And the cornerstone goes where? In the corner. Awesome, right? It goes in the corner, and the reason being is because you basically measure everything from that cornerstone. The cornerstone had to be perfect so that symmetry and all of that stuff could take place. And Jesus is, in essence, saying, I'm the cornerstone. I'm the Son. You've rejected the cornerstone. And ultimately, I think what Jesus is doing here is Jesus is pointing out their sin. Jesus is kind of throwing shade at them, you know? No one? Shade? Anyone? Urban Dictionary, look it up. You know? And Jesus is kind of pointing the finger at them, saying, listen, you've rejected the Son. Kind of reminds me of the story of David and Nathan in the Old Testament. You remember the story? David saw Bathsheba because she was taking a bath, and he saw her, and he took her as his own, killed her husband in the process. And then Nathan comes in and says, hey, David, so I've got a problem. And Nathan, the prophet, gives this story, this parable, and says, there's this family, and they have this little lamb, and it's a beautiful little lamb, and they raised this little lamb, and it's a part of their house, and they named it Fido, and they kept it in the house, and it slept in the beds, and a beautiful little lamb, part of the family. And then there was this rich guy. And this rich guy has a million lambs, and he's got all that he wants and needs. But he decides to throw a party, and he goes to this family and says, I'm taking your little lamb. But you've got all kinds of lambs. Yeah, but I want this one. And he takes it, kills it, and uses it for a party and a meal. What should happen to that guy? And David's like, oh, we need to go after that guy. We need to go get him. We need that guy, he's going down. We're going to go after him. And Nathan looks at him and says, you're that man. What? How am I? You had plenty of wives. God has blessed you greatly over here with money and riches and houses, and you've got a ton of wives. And there was this little lamb over here that you took as your own. You're that guy. Should we judge you now? And it breaks David's heart, and he repents of his sin. Not the consequences. There's still going to be consequences to his sin, but he repents. And I think Jesus is doing the same to these Pharisees and leaders, saying, listen, you guys, God has sent all these messengers after you. God has ultimately sent me, the Son, here, and you keep on rejecting, you keep on rejecting, you keep on rejecting. What's going to happen? Notice what he says in verse 9, therefore, what will the owner of that vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine dressers and give the vineyard to another. Ultimately, we'll see the fulfillment of this in 70 A.D. Rome would come in, ransack the nation of Israel, and from that time, the nation of Israel will be dispersed throughout the land. But yet God would still have a plan for the nation of Israel. Remember, 1948, Israel becomes a nation again. It's the only nation, the only group of people who have ever been a nation, broke apart, and came back together in human history. God is still working. God's still going to move. God's still going to use the Jews for a greater purpose. In the book of Revelation, we see 144,000 mini Billy Grahams from the nation of Israel go about preaching the gospel. But here Jesus is pointing out a powerful demonstration of love and patience and grace, basically calling out these leaders, saying you keep on rejecting God, you keep on rejecting the Son, you keep on falling into your sinful habits. And what happens, like the old saying goes, when you sow a thought, you reap an action. And when you sow an action, you reap a habit. And when you sow a habit, you reap a character. And when you sow a character, you ultimately reap a destiny. God keeps giving us chance after chance, and yet how stubborn are we as humans? So the whole goal, the whole point is that we don't reject management, that we don't reject the Father and his authority, but rather we submit to it. Notice our next point, though, speaking of government. It says in verse 13, and then they sent to him some who were of the Pharisees and of the Herodians to catch him at his words. And when they came, they said, Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay? But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, Why do you test me? Bring me a denarii that I might see it. And so they brought it. And he said to them, Whose image and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar. And Jesus answered and said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. And they marveled at him. After Jesus points out that they're rejecting his authority and the authority of the Heavenly Father, the landowner, they come and they want to try to trap Jesus in his words. And notice it tells us that the Pharisees and the Herodians gathered together. Now this is an interesting thought line. You've probably heard the old phrase or old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And politics kind of makes strange bedfellows. Well, that was the idea because, well, the Pharisees were strict separatist Jews, totally opposed to Roman rule. And the Herodians, well, they loved Roman rule. They wanted the Romans to rule them. And so what we see here is basically the right-wingers and the left-wingers hanging out together for the purpose of, well, going after Jesus. And notice what they start off by doing. Teacher. Teacher. Basically calling him Rabbi. Rabbi. Imagine the words that they're starting to use here. Oh, we know you don't care about anyone. Not that Jesus didn't care about anyone, but he didn't care what people thought. We know that you don't care about anyone or that you don't regard the person of men. And what they're beginning to do is they're coming at Jesus with flattery. It's kind of what we would call the sandwich approach, right? Where you butter both sides. And so they're coming at Jesus. Oh, teacher, you're so great. We know you speak the truth of God. These are the people that have been trying to kill Jesus for the last 3 years. And yet they come together for the purpose of having to deal with this issue of taxation. It's a question. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? In those days, taxation was a big deal. Today, taxation is a big deal, right? Do we pay taxes? What kind of taxes? How much should we pay? Should we have a flat tax, graduated tax, rich tax, poor tax? I mean, it's a big issue in our own world today. But in those days, well, you had some special privileges being under the Roman rule. Well, you had the Roman road, which connected the entire kingdom. Somebody had to pay for that. You had Roman aqueducts that brought water into various parts of the entire Roman nation. Somebody had to pay for that. You had the Pax Romana, right? The Roman enforced peace, which meant that you could go from city to city without being mugged or jumped or pirated from. Somebody had to pay for that. You had Roman soldiers who ensured that safe travel. So who pays for it? Ultimately, you do. Why? Because the government taxes you. But here was the rub. The Jews didn't like Rome because, well, they were the oppressors. And they viewed paying taxes to them, felt like I am paying taxes to the very people that are taking away my freedoms. And so by my money, I'm funding the oppression over me. And that's why today there are some Christians even who say, you know what, I don't want to pay taxes. And we have a name for those people. They're called prisoners. Why? Because they go to jail. You know? And so Jesus asks them for a denarii. A denarii was literally 1 day's wage. And a denarii had an inscription on it. It had an image of Tiberius, the Caesar. And it was a tax that was enforced in 6 AD by the Romans. And it was a constant reminder to the Jews. Because, well, it had an image on it, which broke one of the commandments, right? Because they didn't like having images. And in this image, it had this picture of Tiberius Caesar, and then on the back it said Divine Augustus, or basically speaking, son of the divine, or son of the high priest, Pontifex Maximus. And so what we see here, are you not entertained? And so we see here, sorry, my mind goes a little bit weird sometimes, and like all these movie quotes, Gladiator, okay. And so these movie quotes come up, but what we see here is Jesus pulls out this coin and says, listen, like whose inscription is this? Well, Caesar's. Well, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. This was revolutionary, probably one of the most important, some say, political statement in human history. Jesus looked upon the taxation of citizens as a service performed. Protection, fire, national defense, salaries, underprivileged programs, so on and so forth. For us as Christians in this context, though, so many times we, or at least looking at what it means for you and I, that we are citizens of a state, of a city. And that means that we should pay our taxes. Now, I don't want you to start like booing me and like throwing the gavel, but it's just straight up scripture. Like, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Now, the hard part is, we live in a nation where we're truly blessed. We really are. We have freedoms, and like I spoke earlier, we have individual rights and so on and so forth. So imagine a Christian reading this verse who lives under communism. A Christian who lives under a dictator. For us, it's a little bit easier for us to grasp and follow through on versus Christians in countries today that are struggling. But this statement, give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's, is considered one of the most influential political statements ever made. It's very much so cultivating or shaping Western civilization. But here's what I love is that Jesus comes in and says, but you need to give to God what is God's. While they can take your money, they can't take your heart. And ultimately, Jesus is speaking, saying, whose image is on this? Well, it's Caesar's, but whose image are we made in? God's. That all humans are made in the image and likeness of God. That all humans are minted in the image and likeness of God. And so we bear his signature, his image in our lives. And so give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God ultimately our hearts, what belongs to God, because we're created in his image and likeness. As we close, two things that I want to take away from this section of Scripture. Number one, obey the government as long as you can. And number two, obey God as long as you live. Obey the government as long as you can. Obey God as long as you live. Number one, obey the government as long as you can. Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. There isn't a conflict here between Jesus and our government and the relationship with God and the relationship with the government. And the reason being is because, well, government has been established by God. Romans chapter 13, Paul's speaking there. 1 Peter, Peter speaking there. They wrote these statements, which I'll read in a sec, when Caesar Nero is on the throne. Caesar Nero was bat crazy, all right? He was a crazy lunatic who killed Christians and burnt them alive in his garden while he rode around in his chariot naked. This guy was bonkers, okay? And so while he is on the throne, Peter and Paul write this. Paul says this in Romans 13. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which is appointed by God. And the authorities that exist have been ordained by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities is resisting the ordinance of God himself. Peter, writing this in 1 Peter chapter 2, says, therefore submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to the governors as those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. Honor kings, honor presidents, honor mayors, honor prime ministers, honor governors, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Jesus wasn't an anarchist, okay? God ordained and organized, first, family in the book of Genesis. And where the family goes, the nation goes. I firmly believe that. 2, he ordained what you could call religion or belief system in the book of Genesis when he tells Adam and Eve that you'll crush the serpent's head and so on, speaking of the coming of the Messiah. And number 3, he did organize government. Now, that doesn't mean that we as believers have to agree with everything our government does. We might not like certain policies or certain ideas. For some of us, we sometimes view voting a certain way as being Christian. It's not always the case, or that you have to watch, Fox News. As believers, it doesn't mean we always agree with every part of our government. And it doesn't mean that we're not necessarily willing to call out evil and call evil for what it is. Jesus did. The prophets did. Remember in the Old Testament, they handled the kings and called out the kings for their evil and called out the pharaohs for their evil. The key to this for us as believers is that it's done out of love and from a position of respect. That we have a legitimate responsibility to honor our government as long as those obligations do not interfere with our ability to worship and honor God. So obey the government as long as you can. But more importantly, our last point, and we'll close with this, obey God as long as you live. Jesus gives the parable of the vine dressers who refuse to honor the master. They refuse to honor upper management. They refuse to come underneath the authority of God. They even killed Jesus in the process. And I believe that that's why Jesus would talk about rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar and to God the things that are God. Acts 5:29 says that we must obey God rather than human authority. And for us, while our money bears the image of our forefathers, we as humans bear the image of our Heavenly Father. And for us, we've been created and minted in His image. And so as human beings, we believe that every single human being, whether alive or not born yet, has value, has dignity, has purpose, has worth, and ultimately has an eternal destination. And so Caesar can collect your money, sure, but God has the right to collect your worship. He has the right to collect your allegiance. He has the right to collect your submission. And so give to God the things that are God's. As creator, as redeemer, as giver of life, He's the one that we get to give it all to. And so sure, they can take your money, but they can't take your heart. And we live in a great nation where we can vote. We might not always agree with policies and so on, or even how our money is used sometimes. But our worship isn't of an earthly king. Our worship is of a heavenly king. And Jesus has outlasted every government, and every political figure that has ever been. He's the one who changes lives. And the more I read the scripture, the more I get into God's word, it's obvious to me that when God's people in the Bible, and even here, rely on a political figure to save, the result is always disappointment. And it's often destruction. And so we got to remember that while politics can try to control the world, it's never going to change the world. The only thing that will ever change the world is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the only thing. And so for us as believers, the real issue is the heart. It's the human heart. It's the human condition. Sure, we might think that our country needs to move in another direction, that we might need some sort of change here, but the kind of change that our country really needs is where God's grace collides with our sinfulness. Because the reality is that if the heart of a person is not impacted with the gospel of Jesus Christ, affairs are still going to rip families apart, and bullying will still take place in our schools, and abortions are still going to happen whether they're legal or not, and drug abuse is going to continue to destroy people's lives, and men will continue to objectify women, and bitterness and anger will drive people to do horrendous things, and the sex trade will still continue to flourish. And all of these things will not be changed by Congress, but rather by Jesus Christ. Those are the only things that will take place. And those who are on these paths are not going to change unless something, or should I say someone, changes them. And that's Jesus. And so God, who loves us so much, would send his only Son to us so that our citizenship, yes, is here of this earth, but ultimately our goal is heaven, our citizenship in heaven, as we eagerly await for our Savior. And for us as Christians, our Independence Day doesn't come on the 4th of July and with the flag, but rather our Independence Day comes on Easter, when Jesus rose from the grave. And this morning we're going to remember that, and remember what Jesus did for us in his death, in his burial, in his resurrection. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, we come to you this morning knowing that change will not come because of legislation, but only because of resurrection.